Do you know how to tell if an Agave utahensis plant is actually seed grown or if it's been harvested from the wild, whether legally or whether or not it's been poached? It's actually not that difficult if you know what you're looking for, but I get asked this question a ton. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. How to identify seed-grown Agave utahensis plants versus wild-grown, wild-harvested Agave utahensis plants. So in another video on this channel, I talked about Agave utahensis poaching. And what I explained there is that not all wild harvested Agave utahensis plants you may see in the market have actually been poached. In fact, there are legitimate rescue operations in this area that are saving Agave utahensis, wild Agave utahensis plants, digging them up in places that they would be destroyed otherwise because of things like mining or housing development. So we do know that not all wild harvested plants are actually poached, because poaching is a legal term that means that the plant has been illegally dug up from the wild, right? But when you're a buyer, say you're an ethical collector of cactuses and succulents and agaves and things like that, and you want to ensure that the plants that you're buying have not been poached, unless you're able to really do the legwork and track down the source of the plant, or you really trust the seller of the plant to you, it can be hard to determine, to figure out whether or not a plant is legally wild harvested or whether or not it's been poached. And so the safest thing to do in those instances is simply to only buy Agave utahensis plants that have been grown from seed in cultivation and haven't been dug up from the wild, legally or illegally. And so that's the question today. How do we determine, and generally we're talking about visual ways to do this so that you can do it when you're looking at a plant online. How do you determine if Agave utahensis has been seed grown in cultivation its entire life, or it's been dug up from the wild? And to answer that, there's actually 4 characteristics. There's 4 visual traits that we can look to figure out if a plant has been wild grown or if it was seed grown, right? The first one is the most important one. It's probably going to be the most obvious one, and it's going to be the most surefire way to determine if a plant grew in the wild or if it was seed grown. Okay, but sometimes it's not always available, particularly when we're talking about buying plants online, and that is its root system. So Agave utahensis, as we probably all know, grows in the desert. It grows in very dry conditions. And to take advantage of what little moisture, what little rain or snow or whatever kind of water it's getting does fall in that environment, they have very fibrous root systems. They produce a whole network of really fine, thin roots that stretch out a great deal and stick close to the surface of the soil for quite an area around it. And when a poacher or a legal harvesting operation is digging up Agave utahensis plants, it's nearly impossible for them to actually dig up all of the roots and to preserve all of the roots. So generally a wild harvested plant, you can tell, if you can see its root system, is gonna have a root system that's been pruned really sharply, really severely. It's not going to have that big ball of fibrous roots that you will see on a seed-grown Agave utahensis plant. So on my website, I sell seed-grown plants that I grow. In fact, that's all I sell is seed-grown plants and seeds. But you can see from my plants that even at a young age, they're only maybe a little more than a year and a half old or so, the ones that I saw on my site, they all have really, big balls of fibrous roots underneath them. And that is a very surefire giveaway that a plant has been seed grown, because if it's grown in a pot its entire life and then just taken out and the soil is washed away, you're still going to see that fibrous root system. But if it's been dug up from the wild, that root system is probably going to have been pruned really severely. Some of those plants can survive actually when their roots have been trimmed like that. Agave utahensis is a really hardy plant, but if you're looking to find only seed-grown plants and you see a plant whose roots have been chopped all up, that's a really good sign that it's been taken from the wild. So the second characteristic, and this is generally a little bit easier because with the root system, we have to see photos of the plant without the soil. Like we have to see it bear root essentially. And while most sellers will be shipping plants to you, if you're buying online, will be shipping them to you bare root, generally a lot of times they don't post photos online, including the root system. I do on the plants that I sell on my website. You can see the actual root system of the plant you're gonna buy. But if you can't see the root system when you're buying an Agave Utahensis, the next best way to determine whether or not that plant was seed grown or harvested from the wild is actually going to be to look at its shape, like the shape of the rosette itself, right? And there's two main characteristics of its shape that will differentiate a wild grown plant from a seed grown plant. Now, the first one is its compactness. Because of the fact that plants in the wild grow very, very slowly. Agave Utahensis is a very slow growing plant. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a second, but it's a very slow growing plant, even in cultivation, even when it's been, given the perfect amount of water, the perfect temperature, the perfect amount of light, all sorts of great nutrients. It's still a very slow growing plant. But in the wild, it's even more slow growing because, of course, it doesn't have, the ideal conditions. There's a ton of UV stress if it's not growing underneath of something that's providing it shade. It's getting very limited amounts of water. There can be high temperatures. There can be low temperatures. There can be snow in a lot of Agave Utahensis habitat. And so the plants will exhibit a very, very compact structure. That is, a plant this big will have a ton of individual leaves, and those leaves will be very, very close together. When you look at plants that have been grown in cultivation, particularly those grown with, artificial lighting or some sort of controlled lighting situation, be that in a greenhouse or, with shade cloth, those plants are going to have much more open leaf structures. They're going to have grown a bit faster than, or quite a bit faster actually, than plants in habitat in the wild. And so they're not going to have quite as compact of a leaf structure of a rosette. Now, the other portion, the other component of shape that can help us determine if a plant's been seed grown or if that Agave Utahensis has been wild harvested is the direction of the leaves, like where the leaves are pointing. Along with that compact shape that a wild harvested Agave Utahensis plant will have, is going to be the fact that the plant leaves are going to be very upright, right? In some cases, they might even curve back, and in some markets, that's referred to as sort of ball shape, right? But either way, those very compact leaves are not going to be spread out super wide. That's usually a trait that you see in cultivated seed-grown Agave Utahensis plants. Again, because they've been grown in very controlled conditions with just the right amount of light. They're not being given too much light, so they don't form this really upright structure, because I believe that upright structure is meant to limit UV stress hitting the broad face of the leaf, right? And so when you see a plant, an Agave Utahensis plant that has really compact rosette, that has a ton of leaves really well packed into each other, really tightly packed into each other, and those leaves are mostly upright or even curving back into itself to make a sort of ball shape, that's a really, really good indicator that that plant spent most of its life growing in the wild rather than growing in cultivation and being seed grown. Again, with seed grown plants, you're gonna have that less compact rosette, and then you're also gonna have more flattened leaves, right? The leaves will have been grown under a much more conducive level of light that doesn't force it to be very upright like that. And so they kind of tend to spread out a little bit more and curve back away from the center of the plant. Now, the third characteristic, and this one is a little less, the first two are really, really bang on. That's when I'm looking at an Agave Utahensis plant online, photos of an Agave Utahensis plant in cultivation, and it's really, really compact. It's got those upright leaves and its roots are all chopped up. That's a really, really good giveaway that that's a wild harvested Agave Utahensis plant. And so these next two are a little bit more difficult, but they can help us kind of build more of a context to understand if a plant's been wild harvested or if it's been seed grown. So the third characteristic is a ring or several layers of yellowed leaves on the outside of the rosette. So this can happen in cultivation. Sometimes, older leaves on a plant, and again, the Agave Utahensis leaves grow from the center, they unfurl from the center. So the leaves on the outside of the plant are actually gonna be the oldest leaves. And it can happen in cultivation that those leaves can turn yellow, can die, can dry up. But generally speaking, when you look at a wild plant, there's gonna be a lot more of those yellowed leaves and perhaps even several layers of yellowed leaves on the outside, because again, habitat conditions for Agave Utahensis are very, very harsh. There's limited water, there's high UV stress and all that sort of stuff. That's gonna mean that a lot of those older leaves will get damaged, desiccated, will dry up and die. And in fact, I think it looks really cool in the wild, right? It's sort of a wabi-sabi kind of imperfection is beauty sort of thing going on with the yellowed leaves on the outside of the plant, several layers or one layer of yellowed leaves on the outside of the plant. But it's fairly rare to see a whole lot of yellowed leaves on the outside of a seed-grown plant that's been grown in cultivation, particularly if that plant has been well cared for. Now, if you see a plant in cultivation, it could be seed-grown, and it could be super old, and it could be what's hard-grown, right? And when most folks say that a plant has been hard grown, what they mean is that it's been given minimal amounts of water, potentially only watered essentially when it rains, and that it's not been protected from the elements in the same way that an indoor plant growing under ideal LED lighting is, or something that's in a greenhouse, or something that's under shade cloth. So it is possible, if you saw a really old plant that was hard grown, that it might have some yellowed leaves around the outside of it. And that's why I say this third characteristic of yellowed leaves is not as cut and dry, it's not as big of a giveaway as the first two characteristics of the root condition and the shape of the rosette when determining whether or not a plant has been seed grown or harvested from the wild. And the fourth and final characteristic, thing that we need to think about when we're identifying or when we're evaluating a plant that we may want to buy to determine whether or not it's been seed grown or whether or not it's been harvested from the wild, is just simply the fact that Agave utahensis is a super duper slow growing plant. It takes, in the wild, most estimates are somewhere between 10 and say 20 years, probably on the upper range of that. There are, in fact, related agaves that take many, many decades to flower, particularly in the wild when they're not being given a whole bunch of nutrients or a whole bunch of water or the perfect conditions. That's how long it takes for Agave utahensis to go from seed to full maturity. So if you're looking at a plant that's really big, it's got a ton of leaves, it looks like a really, really mature plant, you gotta kind of ask yourself, has this seller been around long enough for the decade or more, or 2 decades even, that it probably took this plant to go from a seed to this really old looking plant? And if not, then it's probably been wild harvested, right? Again, the plants that I sell on my website are fairly small. I sell them in 2.75 inch pots. I think they look super cool, and I give my plants that I grow from seed all the best, the ideal temperature, the ideal airflow, the ideal nutrients, the best, amounts of water, the perfect amount of light, and they grow really, really slow. The plants that I'm selling on my website, again, are a year and a quarter, a year and a half or so old, and they're not very big. So if you're seeing a seller, presenting plants to you that look really, really old, unless they've been around for a very, very long time and are charging a lot of money for those plants, they're probably harvested from the wild. This is probably now that's not to say that they've been poached, because again, poaching is a legal term that indicates that a crime of removing those plants from the wild has been committed. It is possible that they were rescued, but the simple fact is they spent years, many, many years, potentially decades, growing in the wild, okay? So those are the 4 characteristics. The root system, when you see an Agave utahensis plant where the roots are all chopped up, it doesn't have that big fibrous root system, it's probably been wild harvested. If you see an Agave utahensis plant that's got really compact leaves, a whole bunch of leaves fit really tightly together, and those leaves are mostly upright or even curving back in on themselves, it's probably wild harvested, not seed grown. If it's got a bunch of damaged yellow leaves or several layers of yellow leaves on the outside, unless it's been super duper hard grown, it's probably not seed grown. It's most likely wild harvested. And if a plant's really, really old, if it's a really mature Agave utahensis plant, and that seller hasn't been around, hasn't been essentially farming Agave utahensis in large scale for decades, then it's probably likely that that plant was wild harvested and not grown from seed. So I'd love to hear from you down in the comments. How do you know if the plants that you're looking at online or the plants that you're thinking about buying are seed grown or harvested from the wild? What are your tells? What are your giveaways that a plant is wild harvested? And do you focus on only growing or buying seed grown plants?